what if my accuser doesn't want to press charges? I know that happens a lot of times between a husband and a wife, or a boyfriend and a girlfriend. They're in a heated argument, something happens, and then she changes her mind either of her own will, or sometimes she's forced to change her mind. What typically happens in those cases?
Erica, I would venture a guess that more than 50% of my cases come from situations where a husband and wife get into an argument and somebody gets so mad during that argument that they decide, I'm going to get one on him and I'm going to call the police, or I'm going to get one on her and I'm going to call the police. And they're just doing it as a threat, and they're just thinking the police are going to come out and they're going to cool us down and everything's going to be fine, and the police are going to go away and say, look, don't do this again, because we don't want to have our time wasted. And what happens in every single one of those circumstances is somebody gets hauled off to jail. And then the person that made the call, the accuser, regrets that decision real fast. And in those situations, the accuser doesn't have control over what happens with the case. Ohio is what's called a no-drop case. So just because the accuser wants the charges dropped doesn't mean that the charges will be dropped. And in those situations, the accuser will often be the individual that hires us. And Ohio has a victims' rights constitutional amendment. So what we do is we work not only to ensure that our clients' rights are protected in the criminal matter, but that the accuser is respected and afforded what is entitled to them under the Ohio Constitution as well.
Oh my gosh, I had no idea that it was that high, where 50% of the cases are just somebody trying to get revenge on the other person and just really showing them and putting them in place by calling the police. That is terrible. And so they don't realize when they do that the fate of their husband or boyfriend or whoever it is not going to be in their hands. They cannot take it back so easily, because whatever they say is going to stick until they get into court and prove things otherwise.
Well, those are the cases that my office handles, and that's anecdotal, but I would venture a guess that a lot of cases are that situation. Time and time again, I have individuals come to me and say, I had no idea that the police would take my spouse away. I had no idea that the police would come and take my children away. Because remember that domestic violence is not a crime exclusively between romantic partners. If a child, acts out and, has an action towards a parent, that can be charged as domestic violence. And likewise, parents against their children can also be charged as domestic violence. Brothers and sisters, even in some cases, long-term roommates can be accused of domestic violence.
So are cases that are domestic violence different in some way to cases where you just happen to be out in public and somebody gets in a fight?
They are, because domestic violence counts as a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence. So they carry additional civil consequences, which is loss of your Second Amendment rights if you are ultimately convicted of it. Under Ohio law, a misdemeanor, under Ohio and federal law, a misdemeanor assault doesn't strip you of your Second Amendment rights, but the domestic violence charge does. So that's the big consequence that's different between assault and domestic violence.
Can you remind the audience what the Second Amendment rights are?
Yeah, your right to bear arms. You get stripped of your right to own a gun, possess a gun, engage in any firearms transactions. And I know, Erica, we're going to discuss in another panel people's Second Amendment rights and how to restore those if they've been stripped from you.
Now, I know this isn't part of your questions, and I'm just digging a little deeper as someone that is not an attorney. So hopefully I'm asking questions that some of the audience might have. Um, but if somebody gets taken off to jail, this is obviously going to affect their life in ways that probably their accuser didn't even think about, which is, possibly they will have a record, a criminal record, which, as we've spoken about in some of our past interviews, can really affect the types of jobs that you can have. You might be working in a car wash and is really an attorney. What if it's a police officer and now their Second Amendment rights are taken away? What happens to that person then? Can they go back and do that job again? I mean, there's a lot of little questions that I have about, what happens to somebody's life once they are accused. Now, of course, I know that you can prove it all wrong and maybe they get all their rights back, but in the meantime it sounds like it could really mess up someone's life.
It absolutely can, Erica. And that's why you want to get an attorney involved who approaches your case holistically. And that's why we take a holistic approach to all of our cases. Many attorneys work in the court realm only. They go in and they negotiate with prosecutors, and maybe they even try cases, although not all criminal attorneys are willing to try cases. But the way that we approach our case and the way that we represent our clients is we're the attorneys that will reach out to your employer and say, look, this is an accusation only. My client is a good employee. My client has a long-standing reputation with you. My client excels at their job. Now, you may need to put my client in a different position for a time period. You talk about the law enforcement officer that can't carry a weapon. You talk about the individual who, maybe they don't want a public-facing position during the time that the allegations are pending. But we take that holistic approach to make sure that our clients' lives are disrupted in the minimal way possible. But the reality is that even going to jail for 24 hours can absolutely destroy a person's life who is a wage worker and now has a no-call, no-show on their employment history, which can result in their termination. People lose their children, and they can't see their children for long periods of time. The consequences of making these allegations, when it's used inappropriately, are so broad and so deep that I really encourage people to think twice. If you are truly an abused person and you need the help of law enforcement, absolutely reach out to law enforcement. Domestic violence is a crime in America that too often escalates to more serious crimes. And not only that, but it's a crime that is often kept in secret. But domestic violence allegations, simply for the sake of ending an argument or getting an edge in a relationship, should never happen. And they really are a blight on our criminal justice system.
Now, and thank you for that response, because that is, it really answers a lot of questions, but also just really shows us what a dire situation this is to falsely accuse somebody, or, to maybe, instead of calling the cops, if it seems like something that can be de-escalated on your own, and, that way you're not going to be missing out on wages that might be helping that family income and pay bills for that household, as well as having to pay out money for attorney's fees, which can bankrupt people in some situations.
Absolutely.